Beneath the old Ruston Bridge, a mother and her son fought the cold and the silence of forgotten lives, until one hidden box unearthed the truth behind 6 lost men and a lifetime of lies. Stay till the end to see how courage can rise from the darkest places. Like and subscribe for more true-hearted American stories that stay with you long after they end. Under the Ruston Bridge, the world was nothing but concrete and echo. Sarah Miller sat against a pylon, wrapped in a patched coat that smelled faintly of mildew and smoke. Above her, trucks thundered past their engines, rumbling like some mechanical storm that never ended. The noise was constant, but she had learned to find comfort in it. It was white noise against the silence of despair. Her small tent, made from a blue tarp she'd salvaged from a construction site, flapped softly in the winter wind. Inside, her 9-year-old son, Eli, slept curled up like a kitten, his small chest rising and falling beneath a pile of donated blankets. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, her breath visible in the icy air. It was late past midnight, and the temperature had dipped below freezing. She had been through cold nights before, but this one felt different. It wasn't the kind of cold you could shake off. It was the kind that seeped into your bones, whispering that tomorrow might not come. Her fingers moved unconsciously toward the pocket of her jeans, where she kept a small orange bottle. The label was worn, her name barely visible. Inside were 4 sleeping pills remnants from the days she'd worked at Mercy General as a nursing assistant before everything fell apart. She turned the bottle over in her hand, feeling the rattle of what could be peace. It would be easy, she thought. One swallow and the pain, the shame, the endless hunger would fade into quiet. But then the tarp rustled. "Mama," a small voice croaked. She froze. Eli's face appeared from beneath the blanket, his eyes groggy, his lips cracked. "Mama, is it morning yet? Not yet, baby. Go back to sleep." He rubbed his eyes and mumbled, "Tomorrow. Can I go to school?" The words hit her harder than the cold ever could. School. That simple, impossible dream. She had promised him once when they still had their apartment, when she still wore scrubs and shoes without holes, that he would go back to school soon. She remembered his first day of kindergarten, how proud she'd been watching him in that too big backpack. Now he didn't even have a backpack, just a plastic grocery bag with a broken zipper to keep his few things dry. Her throat tightened. She put the pill bottle back in her pocket and swallowed hard, forcing her voice steady. "Yeah, baby," she whispered, pulling the blanket tighter around him. "One day soon." He nodded sleepily and drifted back to sleep. Sarah stayed awake, watching the faint light of passing headlights flicker across the concrete walls. Her mind replayed the chain of events that had led her here. Her mother's death, the hospital layoffs, the eviction notice she'd tried to ignore. She had been a woman who followed every rule, worked every overtime shift, helped every patient who needed her. Yet here she was, under a bridge her whole life, fitting into 2 plastic bins and a backpack. She pressed her palms to her eyes, breathing slowly. There was a point where grief turned into numbness, and she'd crossed that line months ago. Now she existed purely on instinct, finding warmth, finding food, keeping Eli safe. Everything else, hope, pride, self-worth, had fallen away like dead skin. A gust of wind blew under the bridge, lifting the tarp. Sarah hurried to secure it with a bungee cord. Across the street, a neon sign flickered from a gas station. Their bathroom, their washing place, their only hint of civilization. She glanced at the sky. Snow was beginning to fall again. Soft flakes that melted against her gloves. She knew she needed to sleep, but fear of freezing kept her alert. From the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow move a tall man with a hood scavenging through the trash bins near the bridge. Ruston had dozens like him. Invisible people. Forgotten names. They all knew not to bother each other. Survival required silence. Sarah took a deep breath and crawled back into the tent lying beside Eli. She could feel his warmth, small, but real. She thought of her mother's voice from long ago. "You don't quit when someone needs you." Her body trembled, not just from cold, but from the weight of that memory. She stared into the darkness, her mind fighting between despair and duty. The pill bottle was still in her pocket. She could feel it pressing against her thigh, a cruel reminder of the choice she hadn't made. Hours later, when the first gray light of dawn bled into the sky, Sarah sat up. The highway above had gone quiet, the world holding its breath. She pulled the blanket from her shoulders, exhaled, and whispered to herself, "Not today." The words didn't sound heroic. They were shaky, barely audible. But they were enough. Enough to mean that for one more day she would fight. She would search for work scrape, for food, find some thread of normalcy for Eli. She didn't know how, but she would. She stood brushing the dirt from her jeans and stepped out into the morning. The air smelled of rain and rust. A truck roared past, shaking the bridge above her, but this time she didn't flinch. Instead, she watched the taillights disappear down the road and felt something faint stir inside her chest, a spark she thought she'd lost. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the memory of it. That morning as she walked toward the gas station to wash up, she caught her reflection in the window. For the first time in months, she didn't look away. By the time the morning sun reached the edge of Ruston Bridge, Sarah's decision had hardened into something quiet but solid. She had survived another night, and that meant she needed to move. Her hands ached from the cold, her breath fogged in the brittle air, but she walked with purpose toward the park on 4th Street, where a metal faucet jutted from the ground near a bench. The water was biting cold, but she let it run over her fingers, scrubbing until the dirt beneath her nails faded. She rinsed her face, the chill stinging her skin awake. Then she tied her hair into a neat knot with an elastic she'd found days ago. The reflection in the puddle was far from the nurse she once knew, yet the simple act of tidying herself gave her a fragile sense of dignity. She heard the church bells in the distance marking 8 o'clock. Across the park, a flyer fluttered against a lamppost. Part-time custodian needed Ruston Public Library. Night shifts. She hesitated before walking over, tracing the ink with her thumb, as if to be sure it was real. The address was only a few blocks away. It felt almost like a sign, though she no longer believed in those. Still, her feet carried her there. The library stood like an old cathedral of silence, its red brick walls softened by ivy. Through the glass doors, Sarah could see rows of shelves rising into shadow dust motes, drifting through beams of morning light. A woman sat at the front desk, her gray hair pulled tight into a bun, glasses perched on the end of her nose. She looked up as Sarah approached. "Yes." Sarah hesitated, aware of her worn coat and scuffed shoes. "I saw the sign, about the night cleaning job." The woman studied her for a moment, eyes narrowing not with suspicion but calculation. "You've cleaned before?" Sarah nodded. "Hospitals, offices. I can start anytime. Name's Jenkins. Marla Jenkins." "We could use the help," the woman said finally. "You'll need to fill out a form, but we're short-staffed. Come tonight 7 sharp. You'll have the place to yourself." Sarah thanked her, her voice almost cracking. As she turned to leave, she caught her reflection in the glass door, a woman standing upright again, even if just for a moment. That night she arrived early, her heart thudding with both hope and fear. The library after dark felt sacred. The world outside was noise and motion, but here everything held its breath. The scent of old paper and lemon polish filled the air. Sarah found the storage closet and rolled out the mop bucket. Each step of the mop against the floor became a rhythm, a prayer of sorts. The silence was deep enough to think in. At first she avoided the front desk where Marla sat reading, but on her second night she noticed something strange. A paper bag sat on the edge of a table near the cleaning supplies. Inside was a sandwich, an apple, and a note written in tidy cursive, "Might as well not go to waste." Sarah looked around. The library was empty except for the distant shuffle of Marla's shoes. She whispered a quiet, "Thank you," no one could hear, and ate slowly, as if the food might vanish if she rushed. Every night after that, there was something waiting soup in a thermos, a muffin, sometimes a cup of tea still warm. Marla never mentioned it. She simply nodded when Sarah passed her eyes, soft behind the glasses. Sarah never asked why. The unspoken kindness between them became a ritual, a small secret stitched into the fabric of her days. One night during a power flicker, the lights dimmed and the library fell into shadow. Sarah paused, holding her mop, her reflection faint in the glass wall. Marla appeared beside her with a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. "Don't worry," she said. "These old buildings breathe when the temperature drops. It's nothing." Sarah nodded, grateful for the light, and for the voice that acknowledged her existence. They stood there for a moment, two women surrounded by silence, each carrying stories they didn't yet know how to share. Later, as the clock struck midnight, Marla gathered her coat. "You lock up when you're done," she said, placing a small silver key on the counter. "I trust you." The words caught Sarah off guard. Trust. It had been so long since anyone had said that to her. She took the key, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, but Marla was already walking towards the door, her figure framed against the dim light outside. When the library emptied, Sarah worked slower, not out of fatigue, but out of reverence. She cleaned each table, each stair, as if wiping away the dust from her own life. For the first time in months, she didn't feel invisible. The building hummed faintly around her, and she let the sound settle into her chest. As dawn crept in, she stepped outside, watching the pale sky unfold. The streets were quiet, just the hum of the early buses and the crunch of frost beneath her shoes. She clutched the silver key in her pocket. For the first time since losing everything, she had somewhere to be, somewhere she was expected. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, she thought, no matter how small, were all that kept the dark from swallowing her whole. The third night of work left Sarah's body aching, but her heart strangely lighter. She stayed an hour past her shift, stacking chairs and wiping fingerprints from the glass doors. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to prolong the feeling of belonging somewhere. When the clock struck 6, she slipped the mop back into its corner and stepped into the early morning air. Ruston was waking slowly. Diesel fumes bakery steamed the faint hum of trucks groaning up the hill. The city felt alive again, and for once she did too. She walked to a small diner off Highway 14, the kind that smelled of fried eggs and burnt coffee no matter the hour. A hand-painted sign on the door read, "Open 24 hours, good food, no questions." The waitress behind the counter greeted her with a tired smile. "Just coffee?" she asked. Sarah nodded. It was all she could afford. The waitress poured it without comment, leaving a small glass of water beside it. The booths were filled with truck drivers in flannel shirts and work boots, their laughter rough but harmless. Sarah sat quietly near the corner, her fingers wrapped around the warm mug, listening to the easy rhythm of strangers who still had somewhere to go. Two men at the counter were deep in conversation. "Blue Ridge Storage is having another auction tomorrow," one said, his voice carrying over the clatter of plates. "Heard a guy found a Harley last month. Sold it for 10 grand. The other man laughed. "Or he found a pile of moldy newspapers. It's a gamble, that's what it is. Folks lose their stuff, you pay their debt, and maybe you strike gold." "Yeah," the first man said, stirring his coffee. "Funny how people can forget a fortune over a few missed payments. You never know what folks leave behind." Sarah kept her gaze on the steam rising from her cup, but her ears caught every word. The idea seemed absurd, bidding on someone's forgotten junk. But the phrase "you never know what folks leave behind" lodged in her mind like a spark refusing to fade. She thought about her own lost things, the apartment key still on her old lanyard, the uniform folded in a box she'd been forced to abandon, the photographs of Eli's first birthday. Everything that made up a life could vanish when you missed one payment. Maybe somewhere in those storage units, another woman's life had been locked away, waiting for a second chance to be seen. When she finished her coffee, she left 2 crumpled dollar bills on the table and walked back to the library. Marla was already there, straightening a cart of returned books. "You're early," she said without looking up. Sarah hesitated before speaking. "I overheard something. There's going to be a storage auction over on Blue Ridge tomorrow. People buy abandoned units. Sometimes they find valuable things." Marla raised an eyebrow. "And sometimes they find a pile of rotted furniture. You thinking of going?" Sarah gave a small shrug. "Maybe. It costs to bid, but what if there's something I could sell?" Marla studied her quietly, the lines around her eyes deepening. "How much do you have?" $47.32, Sarah admitted. Marla sighed softly. then set down the stack of books. If you're going to gamble with hope, keep a little piece of it back for tomorrow. Don't spend every bit of faith in one place. Sarah smiled faintly. I won't. That night she counted the money again in the back corner of the library, folding each bill carefully, as if the paper itself might tear under the weight of her dream. She placed it inside a small cloth pouch and tied it tight with string. When the morning came, she left early, telling Eli, who was staying with another mother under the bridge for the day, that she had an errand. The walk to Blue Ridge took nearly an hour and a half. The road curved past industrial lots and abandoned warehouses, each one with broken windows and sagging roofs like forgotten faces. She passed a group of men unloading pallets, their laughter echoing in the cold air, and wondered if they knew how lucky they were to have work. The storage facility sat at the edge of town, a long row of metal doors stretching like teeth in the sunlight. A small crowd had gathered, mostly men with pickup trucks, worn jackets, and clipboards. They spoke the language of risk and habit, the practiced ease of people used to chasing chances. Sarah stood apart, clutching her cloth pouch, trying to look as though she belonged. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man in a camouflage hat, barked the rules. You pay cash today, clean it out in 48 hours. No refunds, no whining. You get what you get. The crowd chuckled, and Sarah felt her stomach twist. The first few units sold fast, 200 here, 500 there, numbers far beyond her reach. She was about to turn away when the man called Unit 119. 6 months delinquent, starting bid $40. The crowd barely stirred. The door rolled up with a metallic groan, revealing a dim space filled with water-stained boxes and broken furniture. Someone snorted. Not worth the gas. But Sarah stepped closer. Something about the emptiness drew her, the quiet sadness of forgotten things. 40, she said, before she could stop herself. The auctioneer blinked, then shrugged. 40 going once, going twice, sold to the lady in the gray coat. The sound of the gavel struck like a heartbeat in her ears. She handed over her money, palms damp, heart racing. The auctioneer gave her a key and a reminder. You got 48 hours, ma'am. Anything left after that's ours again. As the others moved on to the next unit, Sarah stood alone in front of her purchase, staring into the shadows. The air smelled of damp wood and thyme. She could hear her pulse in her ears, half dread, half wonder. She crouched and brushed her hand against a collapsed cardboard box, the paper crumbling under her fingers. Please, she whispered. Not sure if she was speaking to God, fate, or the ghost of herself, let there be something. The storage unit door rolled upward with a harsh metallic groan, like a deep breath drawn after years of silence. Dust swirled in the beam of Sarah's flashlight, thick as fog. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and iron, that sharp tang of rust mixed with forgotten time. She stood at the threshold, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. Eli clung to her coat sleeve, his eyes wide. Is this it, Mama? He asked softly. Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. This is it. She stepped inside. The concrete floor was cold beneath her boots, and the faint drip of water echoed somewhere deep in the row of units. Inside number 119 lay the remnants of someone else's life. Torn cardboard boxes sagged under their own weight, their contents spilling out, magazines warped by moisture, a lamp missing its shade, a child's toy truck with one wheel gone. Against the far wall, a broken chair leaned like an exhausted man. Sarah ran her fingers over the nearest box. It collapsed under her touch, revealing a stack of old books, their covers blistered and soft. She turned one over and saw mold blooming along the spine. Looks like junk, Eli murmured, kicking at a piece of fabric on the floor. His voice held no judgment, only disappointment, and it pierced her heart. I know, she said quietly, but we'll look through everything. Maybe something survived. She forced herself to keep moving, opening box after box. There were brittle photo frames with faded faces inside, tangled Christmas lights, cracked dishes that once must have served family meals. Every item felt like a ghost whispering a story she couldn't quite hear. The light from the hallway began to fade as afternoon shadows stretched long. Sarah brushed her arm across her forehead, leaving a smear of gray dust. She crouched to examine a small crate filled with glass jars, buttons, screws, marbles, all labeled in careful handwriting that had blurred with time. The neatness of it, the quiet order beneath the decay, made something tighten in her chest. Whoever had owned this unit once cared deeply for small things. "Mama." "What's this?" Eli's voice broke her reverie. He was crouched in the corner near a stack of warped boards leaning against the back wall. She walked over, careful not to trip on the debris. "Just wood, honey. Probably part of an old shelf." But Eli tugged at one of the boards and it shifted slightly. The sound that followed wasn't the dull thud of wood on concrete. It was hollow, a soft echo that didn't belong. Sarah froze. "Wait, do that again." Eli pushed the board once more. The same sound came, faint but distinct. She knelt beside him, brushing away dust with her sleeve. The boards were nailed loosely into the wall, not part of the original structure. Her pulse quickened. "Move back, sweetheart." She wedged her fingers into a gap and pulled. The wood gave way with a splintering crack, releasing a puff of stale air. Behind it was a narrow space, 2 feet deep, hidden between the wall and a sheet of old paneling. In the flashlight beam, something gleamed dully. Sarah reached in her hand, trembling, and touched cold metal. The object was heavy, the size of a toolbox, but older, its surface covered in a fine layer of rust. She lifted it carefully into the open, the hinges creaking faintly as if resisting her intrusion. 3 padlocks hung from its latches, corroded shut. Eli gasped. "Is it treasure?" Sarah managed a shaky laugh. "Maybe not pirate gold." She brushed at the dust, revealing faint initials etched into the lid, TB. The letters were delicate, carved by hand. She frowned, tracing them with her fingertip. Whoever this belonged to, they wanted it to last. Eli leaned closer. "Can we open it?" "Not without tools," Sarah said. "These locks are old but solid." Her eyes darted to the back wall again, to the space where the box had rested for who knew how many years. There was something else there, an envelope yellowed and curled with age. She reached for it and saw a seal of red wax still unbroken. "Should we open that instead?" Eli asked. Sarah hesitated. The sight of the wax seal made her think of something sacred, like opening a tomb. She tucked it gently into her bag instead. "We'll look later somewhere safe." They sat there for a long moment, the silence of the unit pressing around them. The air felt thicker now, charged with the weight of what they had uncovered. Sarah looked at the box, again, its rusted surface dull under the dim light. She didn't know why, but she felt as if it were looking back, waiting. Finally, she stood and brushed the dust from her hands. "Come on, Eli, let's take this with us before it gets dark." He nodded his small hands, helping to lift one side of the box. It was heavier than it looked, dense with secrets. Together they carried it out to the fading daylight, their breaths rising in small white clouds. Sarah locked the unit again, though there was nothing left worth stealing, and tucked the key into her pocket. As they walked toward the bus stop, the metal box knocked softly against her leg, with each step a sound both steady and ominous. She felt its weight not just in her arms, but deep inside her chest. Something about it, those carved initials, the seal, the way it had been hidden, made her think this discovery wasn't luck at all. It felt deliberate, like something had been waiting for her to find it. She didn't tell Eli that thought, though. She simply squeezed his hand and kept walking, the chill of evening creeping down the back of her neck. The metal box sat between them on the kitchen floor of the library's staff break room, its surface dim under the yellow light. Sarah had brought it there after her shift, too restless to wait until morning. She had borrowed a screwdriver from the maintenance closet and spent nearly an hour prying open the corroded locks, each one snapping like brittle bones. Eli sat nearby, holding his breath as the final latch gave way. The lid creaked open, releasing a musty breath of trapped years' dust iron, something faintly sweet, like decayed paper. Inside, the contents were few, but carefully arranged. On top lay 3 small notebooks, bound in cracked leather, their pages yellowed and delicate. Beneath them rested a stack of photographs, black and white edges curling like old leaves. And at the bottom, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, was an envelope sealed with a circle of deep red wax. Sarah lifted the envelope with both hands, feeling the slight weight of the wax between her fingers. For a long time, she didn't move. The handwriting across the front was neat. Elegant, slightly trembling, someone who had written with care. In faded blue ink, the words read, "To whoever finds this, deliver it to the McCleary family. I cannot take this secret to my grave." Her heart skipped. McCleary. She whispered the name aloud, the sound foreign yet familiar. The name belonged to a place she had tried not to remember, a name that still lingered in the corners of her childhood, like the smell of engine oil and cotton dust. The McCleary Textile Factory, her father's workplace, the factory that had gone up in flames when she was 5 years old. Eli looked up at her, curious. "What is it, Mama?" She blinked, her throat suddenly dry. "It's a letter," she said softly, from someone who wanted to tell the truth. She brushed her thumb along the wax seal, hesitating. Part of her wanted to open it immediately, but another part, older, cautious, told her not yet. Some secrets once uncovered could never be put back. Instead, she set the envelope aside and turned her attention to the photographs. The first showed a group of factory workers lined up outside a large brick building, sunlight glinting off the glass windows. Their faces were young, proud, dressed in uniforms marked with the logo McCleary Textile Company. Behind them stood a tall man in a crisp white shirt, his hand on the shoulder of another worker. Sarah stared at the faces one by one, until her breath caught. In the back row, slightly to the right, was a man with familiar eyes, the same shade of gray as her own. He was smiling faintly, his sleeves rolled, a cigarette tucked behind his ear. Her father, Thomas Miller. She hadn't seen that face in decades, not since the morning he left for work and never came home. Her fingers trembled as she traced his image. For years, she had believed the story everyone told that the explosion at McCleary was an accident, a boiler malfunction that killed 6 workers instantly. But something in her father's expression, something in the letter's careful phrasing told her this was no coincidence. Eli leaned closer, his small voice curious. "That's Grandpa, isn't it?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes," she whispered. "It's him." She flipped through the rest of the photographs. Some were of machinery, others of gatherings, men, laughing women serving coffee in enamel cups, a summer picnic under a tree. But in the last photo, the tone changed. It showed a section of the factory floor cordoned off with caution tape. Behind it, the metal beams were twisted, blackened by fire. A shadowed figure stood near the edge of the frame, half turned away from the camera, watching the scene. Someone had drawn a faint circle in pencil around that figure. She set the photo down carefully. Whoever took these knew something, she murmured, mostly to herself. Eli reached for one of the small notebooks. "Can I look careful?" she said, handing him one. The leather cracked under his touch as he opened it. The pages were filled with neat cursive entries, dates written in the margins 1984, 1985. The first few pages listed inventory rolls of fabric maintenance logs. Then, as the entries went on, the handwriting changed shakier, more urgent. Sarah skimmed the last pages. Phrases leapt out like whispers through the years. "Safety valves removed for cost savings. He said no one would find out. Thomas warned me it's only a matter of time." Her pulse quickened. Thomas. Her father's name again. The writer, whoever they were, had been close to him. She turned the book over, searching for a name. On the inside cover, faded ink spelled 2 initials, MMMO. She looked again at the envelope still sealed in wax. MW. The same hand, perhaps, that had written it. Eli watched her with wide eyes. "What's going to happen?" Mama Sarah didn't answer right away. She sat there in the hush of the empty library, surrounded by ghosts of a past she hadn't asked to wake. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, soft flakes catching in the dim light from the window. She felt the weight of the letter, the notebooks, her father's picture, all of it pressing on her like the slow turn of a tide. Finally, she exhaled. "We need to find out who the McCleary family is," she said quietly. "If this belongs to them, they deserve to know what's inside." But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about them. This was about her father, about truth that had waited too long in the dark. She reached for the envelope again, feeling the brittle edge of the paper. The seal gleamed faintly under the light, as if alive, as if daring her to break it. The morning after discovering the letter, Sarah sat at the small library table long after her shift had ended, tracing her fingers over the name McCleary. It felt both familiar and foreign, like a word from a half-remembered prayer. She had not thought about that factory in years, not since her father's death had become just another faded headline. But now, holding that envelope sealed with wax, it was as if the past had reached out and grabbed her wrist. She needed to find the McCleary family, not because the letter told her to, but because something deep inside whispered that her father's story was somehow tied to theirs. It took her 2 days and a dozen questions around town to track down the name Rebecca McCleary. Most people only vaguely remembered her. Used to teach history over at Lincoln High, one woman at the grocery store said. Lives alone now. Quiet type. Doesn't talk much about her daddy. Sarah wrote down the address on a napkin, her hands trembling slightly. When she reached the small house on Alder Street, she stood outside for a long moment before knocking. The place was neat but tired, the paint on the porch railing peeling the curtains drawn halfway against the morning light. A wind chime clinked softly in the breeze, the sound lonely but oddly gentle. The door opened just enough for a woman's cautious eyes to appear. She looked to be in her late 50s with short silver hair and the kind of posture that spoke of years spent standing before a classroom. Yes, she asked. Miss McCleary. Sarah's voice wavered. My name is Sarah Miller. She hesitated, then held up the envelope. I found something that might belong to your family. The woman studied her for a moment before unlocking the door. Come in, she said quietly. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish. A single-framed photograph hung above the mantel, an older man in a work uniform smiling faintly at the camera. Beneath it, a small vase of fresh daisies stood like an offering. Sarah recognized him immediately from the photograph she'd found in the box. Rebecca noticed her glance. That's my father, she said softly. He died in the explosion at McCleary Textile, 1985. Sarah nodded. My father too, she whispered. Thomas Miller. Something shifted in Rebecca's face, surprise first, then recognition. I remember that name, she said slowly. He was one of the 6. I was 17. Sarah placed the envelope on the table between them. The wax seal was still intact, dark and brittle. I found this hidden in a storage unit. The letter was addressed to your family. I thought you should be the one to open it. Rebecca's fingers hovered above it, trembling. For a moment she seemed unable to breathe. Then without a word she broke the seal. The paper inside crackled faintly as she unfolded it. Her eyes moved across the page, the color draining from her face. Sarah sat in silence, listening to the old clock tick on the wall. When Rebecca finally looked up, her voice was barely a whisper. I've waited my whole life for this, she said. Then she read aloud. To the McCleary family, I owe you the truth. My brother Harold Whitman ignored the safety warnings on the boilers. He ordered the pressure valves removed to save on costs even after the foreman protested. When your men died, he called it an accident. I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my fault. But silence has a weight I can no longer bear. I'm leaving this letter with the evidence I collected. If it finds you, let it stand as my confession. Margaret Whitman. The room seemed to contract around them. Sarah felt her pulse in her ears, the words sinking like stones. Whitman, she murmured. The owners of the factory. Rebecca nodded numbly. I remember that name too. Harold Whitman came to our house after the explosion. He told my mother how sorry he was. He even paid for the funeral. She let out a brittle laugh. All these years he knew. And his sister. She knew too. Sarah looked at the letter again. The ink faded but clear. She said she left evidence. Maybe that means there's more, something that proves what happened. Rebecca pressed her palms to her eyes. Do you understand what this means? My father, your father. They didn't die because of a mistake. They died because someone wanted to save a few dollars. Her voice broke raw and trembling. Sarah reached across the table and took her hand. It was cool and small, the skin papery, but strong. We can still do something, she said softly. If there's proof, we can bring it to someone. The truth doesn't disappear just because time passed. Rebecca looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. You sound like my mother. She used to say the same thing. She died thinking no one cared." "I care," Sarah said simply. For a long time they sat in silence, two women bound by the same invisible wound. Outside, the late afternoon light slanted through the window, catching the dust in the air and turning it golden. Rebecca reached for a folder on a nearby shelf and opened it, revealing newspaper clippings she had kept for decades, articles about the explosion names of the victims' photographs of smoke and ruin. "I kept everything," she whispered. "I thought one day someone would ask again, but no one ever did." Sarah traced the name Whitman printed in bold letters across one of the headlines. "Then we'll ask," she said, "and we won't stop until someone answers." Rebecca looked at her with something like hope, fragile, unfamiliar. "If Margaret Whitman wrote this," she said, glancing down at the letter again, "then maybe she left something behind. Maybe she wanted to be found." The light outside dimmed and the room fell into quiet again. Somewhere down the street, a train passed its whistle, long and mournful, fading into the distance. Rebecca folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, her movements deliberate, reverent. "You should keep it for now," she said. "If you found it, maybe it was meant for you." Sarah hesitated, but accepted the envelope, the paper warm from Rebecca's hands. The next afternoon, Sarah returned to Blue Ridge Storage with the same nervous determination that had carried her there the first time. She had promised Rebecca she would look through the unit again to see if anything else had been left behind. Papers, photographs, perhaps more proof of what Margaret had written in her letter. The winter air was sharp enough to sting, and the clouds above hung heavy with snow. She clutched the key to Unit 119 tightly in her palm, unaware that something inside her was about to shift once again. When she reached the row of units, the air felt strangely still. A thin layer of frost coated the padlocks, glinting faintly in the pale sunlight. Her footsteps echoed off the concrete, lonely and hollow. Then she saw it, the metal door of her unit slightly ajar. The padlock twisted open, its shank snapped clean. Her stomach dropped. "No," she whispered, rushing forward. She yanked the door upward, the sound scraping through the silence. Inside, the space looked different. The boxes she had left untouched were scattered across the floor. The air was disturbed, the dust unsettled. Her eyes darted to the far wall where the secret panel had been, the place where the box had been hidden for decades. The panel lay on the ground, cracked in two. The space behind it was empty. The metal box, their only tangible proof, was gone. Sarah stood frozen, her breath visible in the cold air. Her first thought was of Eli, thankfully at school, far from this scene, and her second was of Rebecca, who would be waiting for her call. But before she could even reach for her phone, she felt something else, that creeping sense of being watched. Across the lot, near the exit gate, a black pickup truck sat idling. Its windows were tinted, the engine rumbling low and steady. A thin line of smoke drifted from the driver's window, curling upward in the cold air. Someone was sitting inside, watching her. Sarah's pulse quickened. She took a slow step backward, then another. The truck didn't move. She turned, locked the unit even though there was nothing left to protect, and walked quickly towards the main road. She didn't look back until she reached the corner, and when she did, the truck's headlights flicked on for a brief moment, two white eyes in the distance, before it rolled away, silent and slow. By the time Sarah reached the library, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely fit the key in the door. Inside, the warm light and smell of old paper greeted her like a memory of safety. Marla was shelving books near the front desk and looked up as soon as she saw Sarah's face. "What happened?" she asked. "The box." Sarah managed her voice tight. "It's gone. Someone broke into the unit." Marla's eyes widened. She set down the books, her movements deliberate. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Sarah recounted everything. The broken lock, the scattered boxes, the truck waiting in the distance. Marla listened in silence, her jaw tightening with each detail. When Sarah finished, the older woman let out a so weary sigh. "I was afraid of this," she said. Sarah frowned. Afraid of what? Marla hesitated, then gestured for her to sit. "There's something I haven't told you," she said quietly, "and you deserve to know." They sat at one of the study tables, the library's dim light falling over the grain of the wood. Marla folded her hands, her expression far away. "Before I worked here, I was an accountant," she began. "Back in the 80s. I worked for Whitman Industries." Sarah felt her breath catch. The same Whitman from the letter. Marla nodded. "Harold Whitman. He was the owner. A powerful man in Ruston back then, too powerful. I was young, fresh out of college. I kept the books, balanced the ledgers, and tried not to ask questions. But I noticed numbers that didn't make sense. Missing fund safety expenses cut in half. When I asked my supervisor, he told me not to worry. Said it was business optimization." She paused, her gaze distant. "After the explosion, I went through the accounts again. I found proof internal memos invoices showing the pressure valves had been removed from the boilers to save money. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. Then one night, Margaret Whitman came to see me. She looked terrified. She said she couldn't stay silent anymore. Together we gathered what we could, documents, photos, that letter you found. We sealed them in a metal box and hid it away. She promised she'd come back for it when it was safe. But she never did." Sarah's voice trembled. "You helped her hide it?" Marla nodded. "I did, and I've lived with that secret ever since." She leaned back, exhaustion written deep in her face. "When I saw you that first night in the library, something in your eyes reminded me of her. The same determination, the same grief. That's why I didn't ask questions. I thought maybe fate was circling back." Sarah sat in silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down like a storm. "You think someone knew about the box?" Marla's gaze sharpened. "Someone always knew. Harold Whitman had men who handled his business quietly. If they're still around, or if someone inherited his power, they'd want to keep that box buried." The room felt suddenly smaller, the hum of the lights louder. Sarah's thoughts tumbled in chaos, fear, anger, disbelief. "What do we do now?" she asked finally. Marla looked at her, a fierce sadness in her eyes. "Now we stop being silent. If the box is gone, we find another way. There's always a trail. And maybe it's time someone paid for what they did." The older woman's voice cracked on the last word, but her resolve was unmistakable. She reached across the table, placing her hand over Sarah's. "I thought justice would never come," she said quietly. "But maybe I was wrong. Maybe it's coming through you." Sarah stared at her, the truth of it settling like a tremor in her chest. For the first time since finding the letter, she understood this was no longer about chance. It was about inheritance of pain, of courage, of unfinished reckonings. Outside, a car engine passed slowly along the street, its low hum vibrating through the library windows. Both women turned their heads, instinctively listening. The days following the theft were a blur of unease and whispered plans. The air in Ruston carried the kind of tension that couldn't be named, but was felt in the tightening of shoulders and the silence after footsteps. Sarah barely slept. Each night, the memory of the black truck followed her into her dreams like a shadow that refused to fade. Marla had spent hours at the library searching for backup records, old financial documents she had copied years ago, but hidden in microfilm archives under a different name. Together with the letters and a few fragments of photographs, they had gathered enough to convince Rebecca that what they held might still be enough to expose the truth. They needed help, someone outside Ruston. Marla suggested Daniel Hurst, a freelance journalist based in Pittsburgh, known for investigating corporate crimes no one else dared to touch. Rebecca made the call using a payphone outside the library, her voice shaking as she explained who they were. Daniel agreed to meet them the next day at a small diner on Route 79. They left before dawn, Sarah driving Marla's aging Buick through the dark highway, while Rebecca sat in the back seat holding the folder that contained every piece of evidence they had left. Snow drifted across the road, soft and relentless. The radio played faintly, but none of them were listening. Sarah's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few minutes, watching for the shape she dreaded most. Around the time they reached the edge of Mercer County, she saw a pair of headlights that had been following too long, too steady. "Someone's behind us," she said quietly. Marla turned her head, her face pale. "How long since we left the gas station?" Sarah answered. The lights drew closer, their glare filling the back window. Rebecca clutched the folder tighter. Maybe it's just coincidence. Maybe Sarah said, though she didn't believe it. The truck's engine roared as it switched lanes, pulling alongside them for a brief, chilling moment. Sarah glimpsed the outline of a man smoking behind the tinted glass. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the truck accelerated ahead, vanishing into the night. They exhaled in unison, but the relief was short-lived. 10 minutes later, as they crossed the narrow river bridge, the truck reappeared behind them, its headlights blinding. "Hold on!" Sarah shouted, gripping the wheel as the vehicle rammed them from behind. The Buick swerved, tires screeching against the icy pavement. Rebecca screamed. Marla clutched the dashboard and the folder slid to the floor. The guardrail loomed inches away, the river below a dark, churning void. Sarah slammed the brakes and jerked the wheel sideways. The car spun once, twice before stopping halfway across the bridge, smoke rising from its hood. The truck paused for a second, its lights cutting through the snow, then reversed and disappeared into the darkness. They sat in stunned silence, the sound of their breathing loud in the small car. "Is everyone okay?" Sarah gasped. Marla nodded shakily. Rebecca wiped tears from her face. "They tried to kill us," she whispered. "They don't want the truth out." Sarah picked up the folder, the papers scattered but intact. "Then we're closer than we think," she said, her voice hoarse. By the time they reached Pittsburgh, dawn was breaking pale over the skyline. Daniel Hurst met them at the diner, a wiry man with tired eyes and the cautious curiosity of someone who'd seen too much of the world's quiet cruelty. He listened as they explained everything: the explosion, the letters, the stolen box, the chase on the bridge. He didn't interrupt, only took notes in a battered leather journal. When they finished, he looked at them for a long moment before saying, "If even half of this checks out, it's a story worth burning bridges for." He promised to start digging immediately, verifying names and records. But you should know, he warned, once this goes public, they'll come after you harder. People like the Whitmans don't lose quietly. Sarah nodded. They already tried. Within a week, Daniel's article went live on an independent news site. It was thorough, relentless, and brave. It named names. It mentioned Sarah by name. She hadn't expected that. At first, she didn't care, justice mattered more. But within days, the consequences began. The library dismissed her, citing safety concerns. The shelter where she and Eli had been staying quietly told her they needed the space for someone else. Neighbors who once offered kind smiles now crossed the street. Ruston was a small town. Secrets didn't stay secrets, but neither did heroes stay safe. Sarah packed what little she owned, 2 duffel bags, a blanket, and Eli's worn-out backpack, and walked through the falling snow until she reached the overpass where their journey had first begun. The cold bit through her coat, the wind carrying the scent of wet concrete and exhaust. Eli sat beside her knees, pulled to his chest. He was older now than when they'd first come here, old enough to understand loss, but not yet old enough to stop believing. "Mom," he said quietly, his breath a pale cloud. "Are we losing Sarah?" Looked at him, his eyes so much like her father's, tired, but still full of that stubborn light. She took his hand in hers, feeling the small, fragile warmth there. "As long as you still believe in me," she said softly. "We haven't lost anything." He leaned his head against her shoulder, and for a moment the roar of passing cars above them sounded almost like the ocean, endless, indifferent, but still moving forward. Sarah stared into the dark, her mind filled with the faces of Rebecca and Marla, with the image of that black truck disappearing into the night. Somewhere in Pittsburgh, Daniel Hurst was writing again. Somewhere in Ruston, someone was watching. But under that bridge, surrounded by cold and noise and fear, she found something fierce and unyielding, a spark that refused to die. The article hit the nation like a tremor that no one had prepared for. Daniel Hurst didn't publish just a single piece. He released a series, 3 parts in total, under the title, The Factory That Buried Its Dead. It began with the story of 6 men who had gone to work one April morning in 1985 and never returned, their deaths written off as a boiler malfunction. It told of the missing safety valves, the falsified reports, and the money that had been quietly diverted into private accounts. But what gripped the country wasn't just the corruption. It was the photograph of Sarah and Eli under the bridge taken without their knowledge, included at the end of the second article, with the caption, "The daughter of one victim still living in the shadow of the factory's silence." Within days, the story spread to major outlets. Television anchors debated it. Commentators argued about corporate greed and the forgotten working class. People who had never heard of Ruston now spoke its name like a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in the American heartland. There were protests outside what remained of Whitman Industries. Former workers came forward with stories that matched the ones Sarah had uncovered. The Department of Justice announced a formal investigation. For the first time in 4 decades, the Whitman family could no longer buy silence. Harold Whitman, now 81, was photographed leaving his estate in Pennsylvania under the escort of federal agents. His once impeccable posture was bent, his eyes sunken behind thick glasses. When reporters shouted questions, he said nothing, only raised a shaking hand, as if to ward off ghosts. For Sarah, watching the footage on a borrowed television in the shelter's common room, it felt unreal. The man who had haunted her family's story, who had lived untouched for so long, was finally being forced to face the truth. But victory, when it came, didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion, the kind that seeps into the bones. Daniel called her 2 days later. His voice sounded different, heavier. "They've agreed to let me interview him," he said. "He wants to talk before the hearings begin. I think he's scared, but not of prison, of dying with no one listening." Sarah hesitated. "Will you go?" "I have to," Daniel replied. "Someone needs to hear what he says." The interview took place in a hospice wing of St. Mary's Hospital. Harold was too weak to stand, his hands mottled with age spots, a blanket tucked around his thin shoulders. The camera light cast long shadows across the bed. When Daniel asked why he had stayed silent for so long, Harold smiled faintly, a ghost of arrogance still lingering. Because silence was profitable, he said. His voice cracked, but didn't break. No one wanted the truth. Not the investors, not the board, not even the public. People prefer stories that make sense, and accident is easier to understand than greed. Daniel leaned forward. But you knew men died because of your decision. Harold's eyes flickered toward the window. Outside, snow fell in slow, uncertain flakes. No one in that office intended to kill anyone. He murmured. "We thought we were saving a few dollars, keeping the factory afloat. It was supposed to be temporary. Then the boiler blew, and everything after that was shadows. We buried the truth to survive. But the thing about the dark," he added, his gaze distant, "is that it doesn't stay where you leave it." The interview lasted less than an hour. Harold grew weaker with each answer, his words drifting toward confession, and then fading into regret. When it aired on national television 3 nights later, millions watched in silence. He ended the conversation by looking straight into the camera and saying, almost to himself, "We just wanted to save a little money." Then, everything turned to darkness. 1 week later, Harold Whitman died of heart failure. The news broke quietly in the middle of the night, buried between political scandals and winter storm warnings. No one lit a candle at his gate. No one sent flowers. Even his children issued only a single line to the press: "The family requests privacy during this difficult time." But in Ruston, candles did appear at the chain-link fence outside the ruins of McCleary Textile. Old workers, their hair now silver, stood in the cold, holding photographs of the men they had lost. Rebecca was there too, her gloved hands trembling as she placed a single white flower beneath her father's name, carved into a plaque someone had made years ago. Sarah stood beside her, Eli holding her coat sleeve. Reporters asked if she felt justice had been served. She thought about it, about the nights under the bridge, about Marla's trembling confession, about Daniel's bloodshot eyes after weeks of writing and threats. "Justice," she said quietly. "It's not about winning. It's about remembering who we lost. After Harold's death, the government seized parts of the Whitman estate. Millions were set aside for compensation." But Sarah refused to take the check that arrived in her name. She couldn't cash grief. Money could not rewrite a life. Instead, she asked that it be given to the families still waiting, those who had no one left to claim their dead. Marla's health began to fail that winter. The strain of the months, the fear and guilt she had carried for decades took its toll. Sarah visited her in the hospital often, reading aloud from the newspapers she brought. "They're still talking about the factory," she said one evening, sitting by her bedside. "Your name's not mentioned, but your courage is in every word." Marla smiled weakly. "I only did what I should have done 40 years ago. You did what I couldn't." She reached out her frail fingers, brushing Sarah's wrist. "Promise me something. Don't let them turn this into a story about villains and heroes. We were all just people who looked away when we shouldn't have." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. When Marla passed away a week later, the library closed for a day in her memory. Daniel wrote a brief obituary that ended simply, "She kept the truth safe until someone was brave enough to find it again." In the months that followed, the world moved on, as it always does. New scandals, new stories, new distractions. But for Sarah, time didn't erase, it deepened. Every bridge she crossed reminded her of that night on the river of headlights cutting through snow, of promises made in whispers. And though the name Whitman no longer carried the power it once did, the shadows it left behind lingered, stretching quietly across generations. The seasons turned quietly after the storm of headlines faded. Winter loosened its grip, and by the time the first spring came, the air in Ruston felt different, softer, though still scarred. The Whitman scandal had changed more than just names in newspapers. It had forced a town built on silence to start speaking again. People who once kept their heads down began to remember. The factory grounds, long abandoned, were cleared by volunteers. The names of the 6 men who had died were etched into a simple memorial stone set at the edge of the lot. There was no ribbon cutting, no speeches, just a circle of families standing in the cold morning, listening to the wind move through the grass where smoke had once risen. Sarah stood among them, her hand clasped around Eli's small fingers. Rebecca stood a few steps away, her posture straight despite the gray in her hair, her eyes reflecting something like peace for the first time in years. With part of the government settlement, she had started the McCleary Fund for Workers' Children, a scholarship for those who had lost parents to workplace accidents. "It's what my father would have wanted," she said during a local interview, her voice steady. "That no child should grow up believing their parent's life was just a number on a company ledger." Sarah had been there that day too, though she kept to the background, smiling faintly as she listened. The fund's logo, a small cotton bloom over a circle of light, appeared later that year on posters in schools across the state. For once, the McCleary name meant something good. Sarah herself found a place again, not in headlines, but in the quiet, necessary corners of the world. The Ruston Community Clinic hired her as a nurse for outreach programs, a role that meant walking into the neighborhoods she once avoided. Shelters, underpasses, roadside camps, and caring for people who still lived unseen. On her first day, she carried a box of supplies and a thermos of soup, and she smiled when one of the men asked her name. "Sarah Miller," she said, steady and proud. The words no longer sounded like a secret. Eli grew fast that year. He joined a small public school near the bridge and spent his afternoons helping Marla's old library organize donated books. Sometimes he brought home dog-eared paperbacks for his mother to read after work, and they would sit under the same bridge where they had once huddled for warmth, now transformed into something else entirely. The city moved by Daniel's final article, and the McCleary Fund's growing attention had renovated the space into a community shelter. Wooden benches lined the concrete walls. New lights glowed under the beams, and a small kitchen stood at one end, serving soup and coffee through the winter. No one was turned away. The place that had once echoed with despair now hummed with quiet conversation, laughter, and the sound of life rebuilding itself. On the anniversary of the explosion, the town gathered for a remembrance ceremony. It wasn't grand, just folding chairs, a few heaters, and the steady flicker of candles along the bridge's columns. The cold was sharp that morning, but the crowd stayed wrapped in scarves and silence. Daniel Hurst was there, standing near the back, with his notebook closed, his work finally done. Rebecca spoke briefly, her voice carrying through the still air. "We gather not to reopen wounds, but to honor what was lost. To remember that truth, even when buried, finds its way back to light. When it was Sarah's turn, she stepped forward slowly, her breath visible in the chill. She didn't bring notes. Her words came from the same place her courage had been born, from the long nights, the fear, the small acts of grace that had kept her standing. "For years I thought the bridge above me was the end of the road," she said quietly. "But it turns out it was shelter. It gave me a place to begin again. We all need somewhere to begin." The crowd was still for a long moment, and then a quiet murmur of applause rippled through. Eli, standing beside her, held a small bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in twine. He walked forward and placed it gently at the base of the memorial stone. The inscription had been carved just a week before, for those who were forgotten, and for those who remembered. His mittened hand lingered on the stone, tracing the letters slowly, reverently. When he turned back, his eyes met his mother's, and in that instant, the years between loss and healing seemed to fold into one heartbeat. The wind swept through the underpass, carrying the faint sound of traffic above the hum of ordinary life continuing. Sarah looked around the people gathered the food tables, the small children chasing each other near the heaters, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not pride, not victory, but belonging. The kind that came from having faced darkness and chosen to keep walking toward light anyway. She reached down, took Eli's hand, and pulled him close as the ceremony began to disperse. Snow had started to fall again, light and soft, like memory returning home. "It's cold," Eli said, smiling up at her. "A little," she replied, "but it's a good kind of cold." She tilted her face to the sky, feeling the flakes melt on her skin. The bridge above them no longer loomed. It felt like a roof, built by life itself, holding all that had passed and all that would come. "We're home now, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. Not perfect, but finally home. Around them, candles burned steady in the dusk, their flames small, yet unyielding reflections of the lives that had once been lost and the hearts that refused to forget. If this story touched you, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Which part moved you the most the night under the bridge, the discovery of the letter, or the final moment of peace beneath Ruston Bridge? I'd love to know where you're watching or reading from. Every place has its own kind of light that keeps stories like this alive. Don't forget to subscribe, and stay with us for more stories of quiet courage and redemption.